dated for 5 years and then got married, and I was 20 and Rick was 22. Rick and I both grew up in the same church, so that's where we got married. It was a wonderful, wonderful time, and it was a time when a lot of people really felt that they just had this experience where they felt God kind of there, some of our friends, and at the ceremony. So it was just a very special time. 3 children, 2 boys and 1 girl.
David was born a year and a half after we were married. And then 2.5 years later, Maggie was born, and then 3 years later, Paul was born. And I worked for Eddie Bauer back in those days, and we moved a lot. And I was healthy and working well and progressing in a career. Symptoms? Well, in hindsight, looking back, I probably started getting them when I was in my early 20s. But it wasn't really serious until my early 30s, 1981. Lack of agility. I was always playing sports and tennis, and I couldn't play as well as I did. Actually, it probably started in college because I was not as agile and as fast as I was as a sophomore as I was as a senior.
In football.
In football.
Talk about,
Yeah, I was an intercollegiate football player for 4 years at the University of Utah. And loved it. I would do it all over again. But the primary reason for going to University of Utah, Marcia selected it first, and it was to ski.
Right.
Powder skiing. That was the best deal going. But then in 1981, I had bladder and bowel problems, and the internist doctors couldn't figure it out. So it was another 10 years before I'd try and warm up for a tennis match, and I couldn't finish the warm-up without taking a break and lying down.
I started noticing probably in the 80s that our marriage was a little bit less than energetic. It seemed like being that we were both so athletic and active type of people, that's what we really kind of bonded over, I think, a lot. That all of a sudden it seemed like I thought, well, we should be probably going downtown Chicago, doing some fun things. That was back when we lived there, and we just seemed to be home. Rick seemed sleepy, and there were some times when he went through stressful periods adjusting to a new store at Eddie Bauer, where he would come home and immediately go to sleep. And that seemed odd. But all these things are it's real common to look back and realize, why didn't I know what was going on, or why didn't we talk to a doctor? But you can kind of just write them off, say, oh, well, he was just stressed. It's kind of odd. And we laughed a lot about how Rick would fall asleep when things were stressful. And we just thought that's his way of dealing with stress, which I found to be kind of amazing, because most people are just the opposite. But we just wrote it off to that.
So I went to my regular general practice doctor, and he put me up on a treadmill, and he couldn't figure it out, so he sent me to a neurologist. And the neurologist, after interviewing me and watching me walk a bit right there in the office, said, you probably have, or what did they call it back then? Chronic progressive MS. And I said, oh, okay, that doesn't sound good.
It was very devastating. I think the thing that was the hardest of all, we had dreams to go do things together after the children were raised, because we did have our children kind of young, and we thought, well, it'll be fun to go to Europe and bike and go helicopter skiing and do some of those kind of things while we were still young. And the Dash dream, I think, at that time when Rick was diagnosed was the hardest.
I think I was 17 when they told us.
I guess I was 15 when we found out my dad had MS.
I think maybe it was 1990, so I think I was 10, yeah.
They really minimized it, and it wasn't really a big deal. It's going to be a mild case. And so I remember my parents giving us little brochures or whatever to explain it, and I don't think any of us ever read them. So at first it was just kind of not a big deal.
It's been a slow progression, and the biggest impact, I think, is just him needing to lie down and rest, just on an increasingly consistent basis.
It's been a really steady progression because he has that chronic progressive type of MS. So, once I saw him using a cane and not being able to, run as much, I knew that that was, different. And then, progressively got to walker and then wheelchair. Yeah, I think when he got into a wheelchair, it was definitely like, this is different.
The first big thing was him having to go to the bathroom everywhere and having it be like urgent and we have to go right now. And I remember a couple of different times where that was really hard.
The original doctor that diagnosed me didn't think it was going to be very severe. And he thought I might need a cane someday, but never need a walker, a wheelchair. But within just a few years, I was 1 cane, 2 cane, and then dropped those and was using a walker.
When I was in college and would come back, I'd be gone for 3 or 4 months at a time and come back. It was like the reverse of watching a little kid grow up. The aunt would see the kid and be like, "Oh, you're so big," and it was the opposite. It would be like, "Oh, okay, this is what's happened. How he's lost like movement."
Denial is a big thing for a guy like me. If there's something wrong, I'm not going to give in to it. I tend not to. And denial is fine, but only to a point.
I didn't go into denial very at all, really. And I think that it's healthy to go into denial. And Rick, I was glad that he did for his sake. I read once, and I wish I could cite who the author was, but she described MS in marriage as you basically have 2 husbands. And I think that that's how I feel, is that I had my pre-diagnosis and husband and my post-diagnosis husband. And because sadly, Rick's changed that much, although his characters remained the same. But you do feel like that your first marriage is very different from your second. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of loss over that. And the roles that I think the biggest thing that and Rick deserves a lot of credit, is our roles switched, where he was a strong leader. He was the quarterback in high school, so he has kind of a quarterback personality, and he was a strong natural leader, and I was a natural follower and a stay-at-home mom, and I wasn't a softie, but all of a sudden I'm providing for Rick, and thanks to his family also, there's provision, but also Rick's at home and I'm the person who's working, and it took a lot of years of overlapping till finally we adjusted to being different in those different roles, and that was huge.
Oh, it's hard for her. I mean, there's a lot of pressure put on her to, keep everything together and be the provider for the family, and she's kind of lost her husband a little bit, and now she has more of a kid again. So I think that's really hard for her. Doesn't have as much support, as you would from a spouse.
My concern is, if he needs extended care somewhere else and she's left, kind of in the foreground or in the background, and like they're still married, but yet they're divided. And I just think from like a married couple standpoint, like that's just another added hard thing to this disease.
I think it's taken a toll, and I think it's the hardest on her.
Or I think she's just feeling a lot of grief about what she's lost over the last 20 years and what the next 20 years, are looking like, in terms of like where they're going to live, and what that is going to mean for their marriage and things like that. So there's, I worry about that.
It's just hard. It's just, I don't know how you handle it. I don't think there's any recipe for how to handle it.
The worst part of this disease is, of course, at the end. So when he gets to be, bedridden and can't really communicate, that's going to be a really hard time.
To describe MS, it would be something that steals. It's a robber. It steals time and energy.
I've learned that pain is a great teacher in a good way. We seem to learn more by difficulties than we do easy times. And I think that's been true for us as a couple too. But it's slower to learn for couples. For us as a couple, it's taken maybe more pain and longer for us to get used to the changes that we've had to make. And our roles have changed. And when I stopped working, the first 8 months were terrible.
I think I've learned about myself and others that we can go through so much more difficulty and challenges than we ever think that we could bear, and that we eventually you feel like, okay, this is it. I can't suffer anymore, and then you keep going, and like Rick said so well, that it is a teacher, and you learn that you can. And you feel the strength that you get, and as a survivor, I guess you could say. So I guess that's what it is, and it really, both of us have felt like relying on our faith and really believing that God loves us, just being able to take that in, and that's why church has become really important to us, that just being able to hear how much God still loves us in the middle of this difficulty is just important, vital, and but I think that's it, is that learning how strong a person can be, and I think that sets me up in my therapy practice to be able to really believe that my clients can do the same.